Hey there, it is Tom Jordan. So nice to have you along again on this edition of Tom Jordan Live. It's total blanket immunity for the very privileged son of a family that is clearly far above the law, like way, way up there. No law can touch Hunter Biden. If you stole a lollipop in 2014, look the other way. You killed a guy, move on. You can't charge my boy with any of those crimes, no matter what it was. You can't touch him. That's just the way it is now with Hunter Biden, at least for the previous 10 years. That's what President Biden just did yesterday over the Thanksgiving holiday. He didn't just pardon a couple of turkeys. He went way up there. He pardoned a guy that directly links Joe Biden to massive accusations of pay-to-play schemes involving Russia and Ukraine and Uzbekistan and Romania and China. And the accusations include the Biden family reaping tens of millions of dollars from these overseas deals while President Biden was vice president, and even met with these individuals with his son. Matt Gaetz withdrew from consideration after a lot of controversy surrounding him. And it's a fast-paced turn of events. You're planting something in someone else's mind about how they should think about the individual or the topic that you're reporting on, supposedly objectively. The old AP style book was great. The new one, not so much. It is Friday, so we're all looking forward to the weekend. But before we get to the weekend, there's a lot to talk about. Michigan really is this microcosm, a case study of what happens when the far left gains control, in part by operating in secrecy and in deceit and with an attempt at unilateral control over intensely personal and consequential decisions. This is amazing what's going on in this country. Even the loudest voices of opposition are coming to the table, politically speaking. MSNBC's Morning Joe, very much known for the relentless criticism of President-elect Donald Trump, met with him at Mar-a-Lago for the first time in 7 years. Just people that hated his guts. At least that's what they were portraying on MSNBC. I've got a question for you. Did Donald Trump win and Kamala Harris lose the presidential election as a result of too many people being allowed to talk and too many people being allowed to share their political opinions? That is exactly what some people on the left are arguing. That's what they are saying. Yes, too much free speech going on, and that's election interference, they argue, and more people talking is a threat to democracy, is what they claim. So now there are certain voices on the left. They are calling for stricter control over free speech, and they are attributing this loss to so-called misinformation or disinformation from right-leaning media. Instead of doing what they should do is addressing the lies of the left-leaning media and their own failed policies, or acknowledging Trump's support across a diverse an array of groups. They're doubling down instead on claims that Americans are misinformed, and in some cases they are racist or sexist because they voted for Donald Trump. Like, that's all the evidence that they need to make those accusations. Hi there, it's Tom Jordan. We've got a very big show today. We're dealing with this continued threat to shut down speech. Even though the election was won by Donald Trump, the left's effort continues. So we're going to really dive deep into that. But before we get to that, just an update on this long-awaited outcome of which party will have majority over the House of Representatives. And here it is. We got, if you're a conservative, good news. Republicans are set to retain, as you can see the numbers there, control of the House. This is we're calling it, and many different media outlets are calling it as well, this pivotal moment for the GOP as President Donald Trump prepares to implement his America First agenda. Again, multiple news sources and outlets are projecting that the GOP will hold the majority, secured essentially by what was happening out west in Arizona. First-term Congressman Juan Ciscomani's win in Arizona's 6th district there, where he secured a rematch victory against the Democrat there, Kirsten Engel. So Ciscomani beating Engel in this, which pretty much secures the victory for the GOP in the House. The NRCC chairman, Richard Hudson, said the win comes because Republicans never lost sight of their mission. They were disciplined. The GOP's focus on issues, including securing the U.S.-Mexico border, tackling inflation, and addressing the nation's drug and crime crises. House Speaker Mike Johnson came out. He said the House's intent is to hit the ground running with these policies that prioritize American families and American workers. So they're going right down the middle. They're really, I think, acknowledging what most Americans really are concerned about, what they care about. Democrats, they had hoped to reclaim the House of Representatives, but they faced a lot of setbacks, including a change in their presidential ticket, with Vice President Kamala Harris never really answering questions about policies that seem to have suddenly changed for her after she also suddenly replaced President Joe Biden after his rocky debate season. All right, so that's a quick update. We'll keep watching this, and hopefully we're going to get a major player in the House of Representatives on the program tomorrow. We'll keep you updated on that. All right, now I've got a question for you. Did Donald Trump win and Kamala Harris lose the presidential election as a result of too many people being allowed to talk and too many people being allowed to share their political opinions? That is exactly what some people on the left are arguing. That's what they are saying. Yes, too much free speech going on, and that's election interference, they argue, and more people talking is a threat to democracy, is what they claim. So now there are certain voices on the left. They are calling for stricter control over free speech, and they are attributing this loss to so-called misinformation or disinformation from right-leaning media. Instead of doing what they should do is addressing the lies of the left-leaning media and their own failed policies, or acknowledging Trump's support across a diverse an array of groups. They're doubling down instead on claims that Americans are misinformed, and in some cases they are racist or sexist because they voted for Donald Trump. Like, that's all the evidence that they need to make those accusations. So these left-leaning media outlets, which openly favored Kamala Harris, they're now pushing to suppress alternative media as the establishment can no longer monopolize public opinion. So there's that, and all of that is coming up in just a few seconds. We'll talk with Khalil Habib, the Allison and Dorothy Rouse Professor in Politics at Hillsdale College. It is an amazing conversation that we're going to bring your way here in just a few moments. Also, just a reminder to chime in. We'd like to hear from you. You can comment. You can ask me questions as well in the comments section, and I'll get to those in a moment. Remember, YouTube, Facebook, X, we're taking those comments in real time. We'll answer those. And then, of course, this podcast lives on Spotify and Apple Podcasts as well. And the best way you can help Tom Jordan Live, please simply subscribe. Whichever platform you're on, click the notification bell if you could. We'll notify you of new content throughout the day. Won't bug you too much, but we really appreciate you watching, listening, and then sharing our content as well. It's free of charge, but that helps us tremendously. So from my heart to yours, thank you very much. Okay, media bias, the intensified censorship goals. Margot Cleveland, if you haven't read it, she wrote a great piece in the Federalist the other day, and in it she warns that after Trump's recent election win, certain leftist groups have taken the defeat as a reason to clamp down even harder on free speech, rather than reassessing their own policies or their own spreading of demonstrable disinformation, their own lies. They're not addressing that. They want to control the narratives even more to prevent similar electoral outcomes in the future. Well, wait, Tom, what do you mean the legacy media's own lies and their own disinformation? What do you base that claim on, Tom? You ask, which some people do. Well, here's just a smattering, just a few, a sampling, if you will. So we can go back to the Russia collusion narrative that was CNN, MSNBC, the New York Times, the Washington Post, ABC, NBC, CBS, everybody in the legacy media was covering this. They spent years pushing the Trump-Russia collusion story. Totally unverified stories about secret contacts and alleged meetings. All of that was later totally discredited. There was never any proof that any of that had existed, but the media ran that down our throats for years, trying to get Donald Trump out of office. All of that later discredited, and yet they dominated the media coverage in Donald Trump's first term. And they shaped this narrative that proved to be totally baseless and disinformation, and ultimately led to Joe Biden's victory in 2020, which was the whole point. And speaking of 2020, the Hunter Biden laptop story. In the final weeks of the 2020 election, the New York Post published a story about Hunter Biden's laptop, which contained incriminating information about Joe Biden, his corruption in profiting off his higher office and his policy decisions. in exchange for millions of dollars is a major story that the left-leaning media quickly dismissed. They ignored it. They pretended it was what? Russian disinformation. That whole thing again. Russia's involved here, and that's what this is. It wasn't true. They even thought, I mean, the whole thing that the Hunter Biden laptop was later totally authenticated and verified. In fact, it had been verified already by the New York Post at the time of publication. What was that, September or October of 2020? Verified. So that's another lie, disinformation that the media cooperated in. Then there's the Charlottesville, very fine people lie. And for many years, even still today, left-leaning media reported that Donald Trump referred to neo-Nazis as very fine people when the opposite was true. Trump explicitly condemned the neo-Nazis and the white supremacists time and again, and including that very same speech that they claimed he did the opposite. During that speech, they ignored it. You got the COVID-19 origins, the lab leak theory, the intense lockdowns on U.S. citizens based on a coordinated effort to strip away civil liberties and rights with almost zero health benefits from the lockdowns. They were wrong, in fact. The lockdowns did not work. The vaccine lies, another one that the media still is not allowed to talk about. Did you know that? They're not. There's the 2020 riots as these mostly peaceful protests. Selective coverage of election fraud allegations. There's the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation and, the sexual assault allegations that were not true. Deflection from inflation and economic issues in 2022, January 6th coverage versus the 2020 riots. Censorship collaboration with big tech that the government was involved in. All of that was truly disinformation by left-wing, corporate-controlled, and government-influenced news media. And they're the ones who want to shut down free speech based on disinformation. So they break it down. I mean, there's three theories as to why Kamala Harris lost this election. There's, post-election, the media has kind of floated these theories to explain, how was it that Kamala Harris lost? And some are suggesting, well, voters genuinely rejected the far-left policies of Kamala Harris. That would be the right assessment. Others, however, claim the win reflects deep-rooted prejudice among Americans, that this divisive rhetoric aims to smear Trump supporters instead of acknowledging the failure of policies that don't resonate with the American public. They don't. And then there's the allegations against right-wing media. The most concerning response to me after Trump's win is the belief that Harris's loss was due to misinformation from conservative media outlets. The left-leaning press claiming that Donald Trump's victory came from distorted reporting by platforms like, Fox News or Newsmax or other right-leaning networks. Independent podcasts like this one, accusing them of brainwashing the public. It's staggering media hypocrisy and Democratic Party hypocrisy, who overwhelmingly supported Kamala Harris, the media did, with all this positive coverage, ignoring her major gaffes, ignoring her requirements, her stipulations that the media must agree to before she agrees to do an interview with them. You can't talk about this, that, or the other. You can't because it's going to make her look bad. Joe Rogan, I don't know if you know this, but the other day he said, one of the stipulations is that I couldn't ask her about the legalization of marijuana. And they asked him, well, why didn't Kamala Harris want to talk about that? And he said, well, it's because she locked up like thousands of people when she was prosecutor and she was the attorney general in California. And she was the district attorney in San Francisco. And she doesn't want that out there. So she's completely non-transparent about her own record and about what she truly stands for. So they're now out there criticizing conservative media for, its influence. You can't influence people. You can't have opinions. So the base question in all of this then becomes, how do we discover what's true and what's false? Do we do that by minimizing speech or by maximizing speech? The founders of this country knew the answer to that, clear as day, and so should we. So I got into that and why the First Amendment should never be done away with my conversation earlier with a professor at Hillsdale College. Here's that conversation. Okay, let's bring in Khalil Habib. He's the Associate Professor of Politics. Allison and Dorothy Rouse, Professor in Politics at Hillsdale College. It is so nice to have you. I really appreciate your time because this is, as you know, a very Very an incredibly important topic.
I don't thank you. It's an honor to be here. I wouldn't miss it.
Yeah, thank you. So this election, I think it showed a lot of things, as I think it did in 2020. But there was a real effort, to silence certain speech out there. 2020, we saw it now in 2024, and calling it, disinformation, this kind of ruse, if you want to call it that. That information over there is disinformation, so we need to shut it down. So I guess I'll start off with this before we get real deep into it. But is that a reason enough to censor somebody? Like, if you determine that's what someone's opinion is wrong, is that enough to actually silence and censor that speech?
No, absolutely not. In fact, the only way you can actually combat disinformation is allowing a complete freedom of speech, people to actually push back on claims. To silence them is more propaganda, and it's an infringement on our right to free speech. But the only way to combat disinformation, misinformation, however you want to spin it, is to actually maximize the amount of free speech possible, not limit it.
It's the exact opposite, and that's the whole. I
Mhm.
mean, if you want to find, the foundation of this government is that argumentation was very instrumental in framing even the Constitution. You had to argue, go back and forth, different opinions, and hopefully get to some realm of truth in the end of all of that. And I completely agree with that. And I think this is important too, because we have to define, who really is the arbiter of what is true, because you can easily make the argument, but the ones that are claiming the other side is filled with disinformation in their own right have had their own, years of demonstrable disinformation that they've spouted through the media as well, right? So who is the arbiter of what's true?
Well, obviously, the political parties become the arbiter, and historically, and at least most recently, it's been the Democratic Party has been the arbiter. And now, when Elon took over Twitter, he had to fire people who are even in the intelligence agencies who are in there. So it's either you have free speech or you don't. But you brought up a really good point, actually, in your last remark. You opened by saying that it's completely contrary to the form of government that we have. That's true. I mean, that kind of censorship completely undermines the principles of the American founding. In Federalist 9 and 10, for example, the Federalists wanted to ensure that there was no censorship. There wasn't an effort to, in the interest even of having peace in the country, to give everybody the same opinion, whether it's through political correctness or limiting what they can hear and what they can say. They literally say the only way you can actually control the effects of factions and free speech that could lead to any kind of conflict is to just open it up as much as possible and not limit free speech. So it's contrary completely to the American founding to even want to consider restricting speech, especially around elections. I mean, people are making decisions that are necessary for our national security, people's personal well-being. There's too much at stake, and that's exactly why the powers that be want to have it censored.
Okay, well, to that point, because in the state of Michigan, for example, there is a Secretary of State. You mentioned elections. She's kind of the overseer of the elections in the state, and there are some people who say, "Hey, I witnessed some fraud here. I witnessed this, or I think this happened instead of that." And she, along with the Attorney General in Michigan, along with the governor, and a lot of people within that party, are saying that's disinformation. That is dangerous. We need to isolate that information, identify who's spouting that disinformation, take photos of that person, and turn it into my office. I mean, that's how crazy it's become. And I actually had a conversation the other day with even a member of the opposite party who said, well, there are certain things that you really do have to censor because it becomes dangerous. Like you can't yell fire in a theater. And that's often used as a reason to silence certain speech that might be perceived as, quote unquote, dangerous to democracy. Is that in any realm of, I guess, when you frame it within the Constitution, is that in any sense a valid argument that there are certain things that might shut down democracy that we need to shut them up? And if it involves elections specifically, that's something that we could deem as maybe civilly or even criminally punishable by law.
I am not aware of any restrictions on speech that would undermine democracy. Democracy literally means the ability to speak and that everybody has an equal say and voice. Now, the reason why you can't yell fire, for example, in a theater is because obviously if it's untrue, you're putting people's physical lives in immediate danger. And of course, there are restrictions on, for example, speech related to espionage or treason. You can't hide behind free speech and say, well, I was just passing information to China or whomever. as exercising my free speech. So those obviously have some direct impact, but the ability to challenge an election, the ability to hold elected officials accountable, that is perfectly permitted. And in fact, somebody who had no dog in the fight whatsoever, Alexis de Tocqueville, a great French political philosopher, visited the United States at the time of Andrew Jackson's presidency. And he said one of the great advantages that America has over France, where he came from, is that the media and the citizens can put together associations and newspapers. Today, he would say podcasts and radio, and they can go after elected officials as much as they can, and sometimes even misinformation. And Tocqueville said, even though that might happen, it's still better than any kind of censorship, because what other ways do you have to hold elected officials accountable, if not the ability to call into question what they do, challenge some of their policies, or at least articulate what you think one should consider as a representative? So there's just, no matter where you look at, whether you look at the American founding or from statesmen abroad who visited the country, there are more arguments in favor of freedom of speech than there are restrictions. Usually it's those who can't win in a transparent policy that want that kind of restriction. Democrats have historically never been completely honest about what their policies are. Trump, whether you like him or not, has been very blunt, almost to a fault. And so you have to think about, why is it that you want to restrict things? People have gotten used to managing a narrative and manufacturing public opinion. So things like Twitter and social media have become, quote, dangerous in their minds. And even Hillary Clinton said that if we don't censor, we lose control of the narrative. Well, what does that tell you? That's in the interest of those running for office and maintaining power. It's not in the interest of the citizens who have a God-given right for freedom of speech.
Right. And I know I'm very familiar with that statement from Hillary Clinton and other Democrats. This is the party that wants to censor speech. And she said that basically she needs to do a better job, and the Democratic Party needs to do a better job of collusion and colluding with the news media out there to make sure they have the proper narrative. And
Exactly.
I can, look back. It's not like distant memory. It's very recent history where there have been a number of narratives that have been propagated by the Democratic Party that were demonstrably false, but the media went along with them. And we could just name a few. There was the Hunter Biden laptop, and that was somehow Russian disinformation. There was the whole, Russia, Donald Trump collusion hoax. Members of the news media saying that the president, Donald Trump, was an asset of Russia. He was a spy committing espionage. None of that was true. There wasn't evidence to support it. And those kinds of things continued even through this recent election, where Kamala Harris was not transparent. She wouldn't answer questions, and the media seemed lockstep with her. What does that spell to you in terms of, okay, if even the media is not doing what, the Frenchman who came over and observed how great that was, that we have a free press, they're no longer doing that. Where are we now when we speak of freedom of speech, if even the watchdogs are now in on it, so to speak?
Yeah, that's a great observation. I mean, there's a very important number that came up in the recent election, and that is many demographics had realigned in this election and voted for Trump. The one that I found quite interesting was the ages between 18 and 29. Historically, have always, in other words, sort of college town, young, have always historically broken in majorities with the Democratic candidate. This time around, that wasn't the case. Trump closed the distance and gap in many of those areas, and in some places even won them outright. And I asked and I've polled many people across the country within that age demographic, why do you think this happened? And they said, well, because we get our information from Twitter, from social media. And when they look at no one watches the legacy media. The legacy media is fighting a current war using last war's munitions, and they're just out of date. They haven't realized that no one's paying attention to them anymore. In fact, even Chris Wallace has recently declared that he's leaving mainstream media and he's going to open up a podcast. I think what has happened is something that is extremely healthy for the country. It's the social media, the Twitter phenomenon, the YouTube, whatever else, shows like yours and others. They've defragmented the monopoly that legacy medias have had, which literally became instruments of political parties of both the left and the right, depending on which channel. They're not relevant anymore, except with an older generation. But the younger generation, nobody listens to them. Everybody was aware that everything was contrived with Kamala. Ages ago, nobody would have been aware, because you have now social media where people can get immediate feedback and immediate information, some of it misinformation, some of it not. But at least it's too big and quick to control. So I think what's great about that is that the parties moving forward are going to have to realize there's very few places that they can hide and manufacture their policies. They have to be transparent. Those who love the legacy media and the manufacturing almost like of a Hollywood set delivery of their policies are
Mm.
afraid to run on what they really want. So, for example, Kamala would run certain ads in Michigan about the Middle East, and then other ads in New York that would say the complete opposite. You can't do
Mm.
that anymore. You're literally watching somebody fighting a new war that they've never seen before with old weapons. It's not going to work, and it's going to set them back. And the election results prove it.
Yeah, you're 100% right. The election results do prove this because there is an impact through social media that I am now grateful exists because I've seen in my own personal career what has happened in legacy,
Mm-hmm.
type of
Mm-hmm.
media outlets, which I had to leave for that very same reason. They were controlling
Mm-hmm.
what we were allowed as reporters to do. We could not
Mm-hmm.
cover certain issues any longer because it
Mm-hmm.
didn't fit the narrative. These are newsrooms around the entirety of the country here that are
Mm-hmm.
now engaged in this. And thankfully, the technology is to the point now where we can have these open dialogues. We can question those in power like we're supposed to do, like they did, a couple hundred years ago. To that
Mm-hmm.
point, social media and now Twitter or X, after he was purchased by this guy, Elon Musk, you might have heard of him. There's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of pushback against him. And there's these reports out, there's groups like the Center for Countering Digital Hate. They do now have strategies in place to kill Musk's X because Musk and X and Twitter, whatever you want to call it, they are no longer censoring conservative speech like the other social media platforms have been for quite some time, YouTube and some of these other places that are actively doing that kind of things. So, how far do you think these groups, whatever the ruse is, whatever their guise, the guise of hate speech, we need to silence it because conservatives are filled with hate, which thankfully, again, to your point, most people are realizing that's not exactly true. But
Mm-hmm.
but that being said, how far do you think they're willing to go to shut down Twitter and any platform like this one, even in order to censor and silence those who disagree with the mainstream narrative?
Never underestimate the length, the extent to which any of these power players want to maintain control. If it means shutting you down and they get to live another year, they'll do it. I don't put anything past them. Elon's an interesting phenomenon because he was asked the very same question actually a couple of years ago when he first bought it, and somebody asked him what would happen if the powers that be swarm around you, destroy advertising, bring it down, and he said, "Well, this time." The whole world will know. And I thought that was interesting. One of the things
Hmm.
that Elon did that was crucial in this election is any shenanigans that were going on, he was able to echo it across the world. And now his app is number one all over the planet, which is astonishing. It wasn't before. Because mostly it was used for color revolutions and propaganda, and he finally defragmented it. So let me give you an example. When that terrible storm came and hit the South, no one, I didn't know that there were efforts to prevent him from bringing Starlink down there
Hmm.
and efforts to keep Trump and others from helping. The only reason people knew that was because of X. And at this point, the cat's out of the bag. It's too big to bring down. And at this point, if they were to attempt to do that, their tyranny would show. It would become so obvious. He was trying to do good. And you can say, well, he was doing it because it's an election. Who cares? The fact of the matter is, he was there to do something and offer a service, and there were efforts to prevent him from doing that. Now the whole world knows. Here I am in Michigan, and I found out about it, and I would not have found out about it if there wasn't an alternative to these media outlets. So I think they're, of course, for that reason, precisely because he's so effective, he's literally stripping them of whatever manufacturing tools they had for public opinion right before our very eyes. The other thing is, I don't think you can underestimate how much Trump is also responsible for destroying legacy media. On the one hand, they're responsible because they just overplayed their hand. But as he was attacking them constantly as fake news, people started paying attention. And then when they would weigh what they would see with their own eyes on one channel with what the unedited looked like, it became pretty clear that he was actually right, that they were as he said, the enemies of the people. Now, whether he intuited that or not, The fact of the matter is, the American founders saw anyone who infringing on freedom of speech as enemies of the people. Alexis de Tocqueville saw anyone who infringed on freedom of speech as enemies of the people.
Mm.
Political power gets extremely dangerous if it is concentrated. And the only tools we have as citizens is the ability to speak openly, to connect, to form friendships, associations, and without any restriction on our ability to push back against power, to challenge and to articulate. That's exactly why there's a drive by those who are frankly losing the American mind, why they want to censor. They could not remain in power if they couldn't manufacture a vision of what they want, and the people have voted against it. Elon's too big. I think there's no going back.
Yeah, and Elon wasn't Donald Trump. He was a different animal. He came out of more of a liberal mindset, and even he was
Correct.
seeing in real time what was happening. And I do give I give Donald Trump a lot of credit because back in 2016, he was calling out the media as being fake. And me at that time working in the legacy media news outlets, I would watch and pay attention. I'd be a part of these 1 hour, 2 hour press conferences, and I would see the entirety of what was being said. And then I would see how our newsrooms were covering it, and it was fake. It wasn't true. It's not what was said, and it wasn't It wasn't what happened either. So Donald Trump at that time got a lot of pushback saying, "Oh, he's going after journalists, the arbiters of truth and the protectors of democracy." No, he's going after them because you're exactly the opposite of what you're pretending to be. And so I'm very grateful for that. And he stood his ground against severe opposition. That might be what it takes, right? You got to stand your ground, see it all the way through, because eventually the truth rises to the surface, right? So how would you recommend people do that? I mean, you look back to the founders, they stood their ground, and there was tremendous sacrifice in order to allow these freedoms to exist for this great country. How would you recommend, getting that spine of steel, your face like flint, nothing's going to move you, to get to the truth?
What was the question? How to what now?
How do you recommend, what was it about the founders that gave them this
I see.
spine of steel to make
Got it.
sure that regardless of the opposition, they were not going to be moved?
Yeah, that's a great question. They were steeped in the Bible, the philosophies of John Locke and Montesquieu. And if you look at the early American founding, those were the three main resources that they would often cite when they were debating the country and its institutions. For John Locke and for the Bible, we have these God-given natural rights, and among them is the ability to articulate what our views are and to debate. It's a Western tradition to consider ourselves as collaborators in a political project. So the whole purpose of government, according to Locke, is not just to simply protect your life and your liberty, but to also protect your ability to speak. How else in a representative government can you possibly represent the consent of the governed if they're not allowed to push back and to articulate and to speak? I mean, it's just literally woven into the fabric of the country. And the founders in Federalist 9, again, any one of your viewers who wants to take a look, it's Federalist Papers 9 and 10. They weighed the possibility, should we just limit speech in an effort to just make people get along and not have strife and conflict? Should we just give everybody the same opinions, i.e., introduce something like what we would today call political correctness? And they resoundingly said, absolutely not. The only option is to have a large confederated republic like ours that would allow maximum freedom of speech. There was no other way to deal with debate in politics than to hold, again, elected officials accountable. You see it even in the tradition of the early Renaissance. Machiavelli in his discourses says that there should be no restrictions even on making accusations against public officials. Not slander, that's different. If it can be proven in a court of law and you have evidence of any kind of malfeasance, there's no other way to literally check those who enter power in powerful positions and are ostensibly representing the consent of the governed. So the founders were steeped in that tradition, from John Adams to of the Federalists, even the Anti-Federalists. Nobody was in favor of restrictions of speech, especially after they had fought the American Revolution. They didn't think that the purpose of government was to limit it. It was to give it complete open space. That's why they also adopted Roman names. It was a throwback to the era when the Romans would deliberate openly and publicly and without fear. It is very American to embrace that kind of freedom of speech, and it's frankly completely un-American to restrict it.
It's a shame how popular it is now to try to silence quote unquote disinformation to the point where
Mhm.
now our elected leaders are publicly stating that is the right thing to do to counter hate and whatnot. One
Mhm.
final question,
Mhm.
I'll let you go. When you
Sure.
talk about, the United States right now, what's happening in this country and our culture is not unique in the effort to silence speech. There's a lot of international efforts to do this. A lot of foreign entities. You mentioned Elon Musk's X is doing quite well overseas, and
Mhm.
I think back to the
Mhm.
Arab Spring when people were starting to realize, oh wait, there's social media here, and these countries that were silencing individuals couldn't do it because they had Twitter back then, and
Mhm.
these social
Mhm.
media. It's
Mhm.
very freeing to a lot of people, but there is a strong concerted effort internationally to shut down Elon Musk and conservative networks or voices in that regard. How entrenched do you think this current iteration of the U.S. government is in those international efforts?
Well, I don't know about that, but I don't know an accurate answer to that. All I know is the reason why it's global is that for centuries, since frankly after the World War II, governments have gotten too big, too powerful, and they've started to control what their constituents hear and see. What Trump did is he made it possible for people around the world to see that there can be a populist movement that can reclaim the governments that were ostensibly there to serve them. That's why he was such a world phenomenon and why many countries wanted to try to stamp out Elon. But again, he's too big. Every time you do that, no matter what country you're in now, it looks like an obvious play to restrict freedom. Why would you do that? If you were governing in the interest of your citizens, wouldn't you want to be as transparent as possible? Look what Elon is doing now. He's now apparently head of the Department of Efficiency or whatever it's called. And he
Yes.
said they're going to post everything that they're going to consider online, everything, so that there's be total transparency. Well, if you believe in what you're doing, you want to be proud of it, you should be open about it. Why have
Mm.
anything even closed door like that? And it's too late. It's over. People now are aware because of social media and the internet that for a long time they have been kept in the dark. They're not going back. Once you have a whiff of freedom, you're not going to put the yoke of tyranny on yourself again. And so all over the world, you can see that people are craving to find real information. And people aren't stupid. Most people can tell disinformation from misinformation. And when you open up freedom of speech entirely, there's ways to check against that. You just let the free market of ideas shake that all out. How much is the U.S. government involved in anything like that over abroad? I don't know, but all I know is that they weren't able to pull it off here, and I think globally people are seeing what can be done
Mm.
with respect to overzealous politicians, and it's always the answer is always freedom, just like our founders had argued.
Yeah, got to hold them accountable. And by the way, I wouldn't have known that FEMA had prevented aid going to Donald Trump supporters during the
Mm-hmm.
hurricane in North Carolina
Mm-hmm.
if it wasn't
Mm-hmm.
for social media because the news
Mm-hmm.
outlets were not covering it. They were
Mm-hmm.
they were legitimately ignoring houses with Donald Trump signs in the yards. Don't give them
Mm-hmm.
aid after this hurricane.
Mm-hmm.
Give it to the others as well. That is absolutely
Mm-hmm.
wrong. So again, the importance of honesty and transparency in nowadays alternative media sources, unlike the legacy media outlets. So I appreciate your time. I'm really grateful for what you're fighting
Likewise.
for, and you're
Thank you
you're a
very
great
much.
voice there at Hillsdale College. Khalil Habib is the associate professor of politics. Allison and Dorothy Rouse, professor in politics. Khalil, so nice to talk to you. Thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Likewise. I hope we do it again. Thank you. Have a good day.
You too.
Take
Thanks so
care.
much.